読み直しているで読み直しているだけがで読み直しているで読み直してで読み直しているで読み直しているで読み直しているエキスしたい人で読み直しているで読み直しているだけがで読み直しているで読み直している
Good evening and welcome to this Policy Pitch Election Special. I'm Sarah Slade, Acting CEO of State Library Victoria. On behalf of State Library Victoria, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional lands of all the Victorian Aboriginal clans and their cultural practices and knowledge systems. We recognise that our collections hold traditional cultural knowledge belonging to the Indigenous communities in Victoria and around the country. We support communities to protect the integrity of this information gathered from their ancestors in the colonial period. We pay our respects to their elders, past and present, who have handed down these systems of practice to each new generation for millennia. I'd like to extend a special welcome to our speakers for tonight, who you can see on stage: Danielle Wood, Stephen Duckett, Marion Terrell, Tony Wood and Brendan Coates. To Grattan Institute members, library members, and a very warm welcome to those of you who are watching the live stream at home this evening. Tonight's policy pitch focuses on policy priorities for the next government, whoever they may be. With only days to go until the federal election, Grattan Institute has mapped out a policy blueprint for the incoming government in their Orange Book 2022. The Orange Book calls for bold reforms around tax, healthcare, education, housing and childcare, as well as stronger action on climate change and a Commonwealth Integrity Commission. It's an ambitious set of policy recommendations that builds on research and analysis published by Grattan Institute since it was founded 13 years ago, and it identifies many opportunities to improve the standard of living for Australians. Tonight we'll hear from a panel of experts on why the Orange Book recommendations are crucial to building a better Australia, and you'll have a chance to ask them your own questions as well. The library is a place for Victorians to develop and explore knowledge and ideas, and I'm proud that we're able to host events like the Policy Pitch that promote debate and discussion of the important issues of our time. I'm delighted that our ongoing partnership with Grattan Institute, one of Australia's most respected public policy think tanks, continues to deliver important conversations and insights into significant public policy issues. If you'd like to continue your reading on the topic after tonight's discussion, a reading list curated by our librarians is now available on the State Library Victoria website, and this includes the full Orange Book report. The reading list includes books, articles and e-books, which you can access with a free State Library Victoria Access membership, and you can find out more about membership and the reading list at slv.vic.gov.au. So now I'd like to introduce this evening's panel. Leading tonight's discussion is Danielle Wood, CEO of Grattan Institute and Head of Grattan's Budgets and Government Program. Danielle has published extensively on economic reform priorities, budget policy, tax reform, generational inequality and reforming political institutions. She previously worked at the Australian Competition and Consumer Commission, NERA Economic Consulting and the Productivity Commission. She's the National President of the Economic Society of Australia and co-founder and former chair of the Women in Economics Network. Danielle is joined by Stephen Duckett, the former Director of Grattan's Health Program, Marion Terrell, Director of Grattan's Transport and Cities Program, Tony Wood, Director of Grattan's Energy and Climate Change Program, and Brendan Coates, Grattan's Economic Policy Program Director. Please join me in welcoming our panel.
Imagine what has transpired in the past 3 years, and certainly None of it on the health front, on the economic front, on the geopolitics front, I think was really in our minds at that point in time. So we are in a different world. We are having quite a different election campaign this time around as well. I think policy discussion is a bit more thin on the ground. It's not non-existent, but it's certainly not front and centre in the way that it was in the 2019 election. But we are here tonight to talk about policy. Our policy experts are going to share their vision with you for the next 3 years and beyond. The conversation, as Sarah has said, is inspired by, it's informed by Grattan's Orange Book. We do put it out before each federal election. It's our sort of riff on the public service red and blue books, the incoming government briefs that the public servants prepare for an incoming coalition government or Labor government. The Orange Book sets out what we think the priorities should be for the next government, no matter what their political stripes. So we are going to go through not all of the content in the Orange Book today, but we're going to give you some of the highlights package. I'm delighted to be joined by several of our current program directors, one of our former program directors who can't stay away, but Stephen is now an honorary professor at the University of Melbourne. So I'm going to shoot some questions at the panel for the next 35 minutes or so. Then I'm going to come to people in the room to have your chance to ask questions as well. So let's start at the highest level. For each of you, what do you consider to be the biggest challenges for the next government in your particular policy area? And how do you feel the policy offerings at the election are measuring up to that challenge? Brendan, why don't I start with you?
No, thank you, Danny. And so, if we're thinking about where we are today on economic policy, how the economy is doing, compared to where we were in 2019, this is an incredible result that where we are today, in the sense that unemployment is at 4%. Grattan was thinking when the COVID pandemic first occurred, we could be seeing unemployment rates 6-7% now, peaking 10% and above during the peak of the crisis. So in that sense, at the moment, the fact the unemployment rate is so low is actually a sign of the strength of the economy and the success of macro policy over the last couple of years. So within Grattan, I'm always proselytising about the importance of monetary policy or fiscal policy, about macro, to a bunch of people that are either microeconomists or non-economists, and always often get glazed eyes, or not the most, they're not the most excitable bunch when it comes to that stuff. But I think what we're seeing at the moment is the success of macro in Australia at the moment. So at the moment, the benefits of that low unemployment rate go to those at the bottom. So unemployment, when it falls twice as fast for low wage, low worth workers. So that's a success. The flip side of that is we now have inflation. So the challenge we have is the fact that inflation is high. It's running at 5.1%. We're going to have these issues for the next couple of years. So far, neither side of politics has been really clear how they're going to deal with that. Particularly because, even the budget itself added roughly 1%, a little bit more to demand, in these cost of living measures. In the short term, we're going to have to deal with inflation really seriously. The risk is that inflation leads to stronger wage growth, which would be great, certainly in the long term, but in the short term, the risk is that is passed on to essentially into high prices that leads to sort of a wage price kind of spiral, and we have to worry about that, and the Reserve Bank pushes back further. So neither side's been really clear about how they're going to handle that. The next big problem I think we face is that while the economy is running really strongly, long-term productivity growth has been very weak. We're in a world where productivity has been weak for a decade. Real wage growth has been weak for close to essentially a decade now. A lot of that, if we'd had the same level of productivity growth in the decade leading up to, say, 2011-12, in the decade since, or we'd all be about 10% richer than we are today. Now, there's not a lot from the major parties on that either. This is not an area where the major parties are making tough choices. Some of the things that we would like to see, whether it be, more on tax reform, whether it be, land use planning reform and the Commonwealth helping the states to do that. That's an area we think there's huge potential. Those are not on the agenda of federal governments or the opposition at the moment. One area we think that they should look is probably on migration policy. So Grattan's been doing work on migration for the last couple of years. And the reason why we think it's such a low-hanging area of fruit for us is not to focus on the size of the intake. That's what everyone focuses on. Instead, we should be focusing on the composition of the skilled intake in particular, because there's some people that do very well, and there are some people in Australia who come as skilled migrants who are older, who tend not to speak great English, who don't earn high incomes, and that doesn't bring benefits to the rest of the Australian community. And so even changing that is a really easy thing to do because the federal government, the executive, has full control over that. You know, they set migration policy, they don't need to go to Parliament. And so if there's an area of reform that we would hope to see in the election campaign, that we would hope to see after the election, it would probably be reforming some of that skilled migration mix, but we haven't seen a lot of evidence of that to date.
We might come back to some of those points. Stephen, health's another area that's been on a bit of a roller coaster journey. What are the big challenges and are they being addressed?
So the first one I'd mention is COVID. COVID is real. We've had 3 times as many deaths from COVID this year as we had in the previous 2. There's a continuing pressure on the hospital system. The hospital system was already under pressure before COVID. It's under worse pressure now. Staff are exhausted. There's a huge care deficit, both what I call system deferred care, elective procedures that were cancelled during the height of the pandemic, and also patient deferred care, people who didn't go and see their GP because of a suspicious lump. So there's a whole lot of deferred care that needs to be addressed. And as I said, the system was under pressure to start with. Neither side has made any comment about that, about what they're going to do about it. So to the extent that the coalition has said anything, they've said, oh, it's a state issue, you know, put our fingers in our ears, go la, 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 la. They've also said, we've done wonderfully on the pandemic. The issue there is, what do we mean by we? The evidence is that up to the end of 2021, there were Australia's pandemic response averted 18,000 deaths or so, primarily because of state action, not Commonwealth action. Commonwealth action undermined rather than supported. So we need to address COVID. If you touch the hospital response, it will cost a lot of money. Anything about hospitals costs a lot of money, and that explains why Labor hasn't wanted to say anything prior to the election. But eventually, if Labor is elected, it's going to have to do something. If Liberals are elected, who knows what they will do, but the states are going to scream, both Labor and the Liberal state, Tasmania and New South Wales. So that's a big issue. Second big issue is climate change, which obviously affects every sector of the economy. It also affects the health sector directly, increased mental illness because of the impacts of bushfires, floods and so on and so forth. But I'll leave Tony to talk about that. Thirdly is primary care. The government released a 10-year strategy which had not a single cent allocated to it. The Labor has said they're going to allocate $750 million, 250 million or so in a full year as the down payment for primary care reform. So that's critical. So those are the 3 big ones, and there are lots and lots of other things, some of which cost a lot of money, like dental care.
All right, we heard climate change sneak in there, Tony, so maybe come to you on the big challenges for the energy and energy sector and climate change more generally.
I think if you look at, again, the last 3 years compared to where we are now versus then, energy prices have broadly come down, emissions in the electricity sector have been coming down, and we haven't had a nasty summer like we had back then, so we've actually survived on a reliability perspective. So this looks pretty good, right? And since then, both sides of politics and all state governments have committed to net zero by 2050. And so you'd say, well, that sounds like a pretty good outcome. Look out for your next communication from your energy retailer. Your price is going to go up. Now, I don't know how much it's going to go up. Each of you will have your own arrangement with an energy retailer. But I've heard now already large customers are seeing increases of more than 50%, and small customers are getting letters from retailers saying 10 to 20%. None of this is the fault of, directly, of either side of politics, and yet they will both claim credit for bringing prices down. So in that world, and then you think about the fact that climate change is the problem emerging, even in the budget speech, in the budget speech, the Treasurer talked about the fiscal impact in the last year of droughts and floods and fires, and failed completely to talk about what's going to happen in the years ahead from floods and droughts and fires and what that's going to do to our fiscal situation. And so we've had this extraordinary trivialisation of the policy issues in a debate which has been dominated by, well, we reckon we can reduce prices by $300 in 10 years' time, and we don't think you can. We think your prices are going to go up in 10 years' time if you get elected. Now, anyone who thinks they can forecast what electricity prices are going to be in 10 years' time is really having a lend of us and of them, but that's where the debate had got to. And then when Labor tried to introduce what is, in fact, fundamentally a policy of the coalition government to reduce emissions on the industrial sector, they were accused of introducing a sneaky carbon tax. Now, it's not a tax for a start, and it's not sneaky. They're actually using what was designed by Greg Hunt when he was the minister back in 2015. So we've got this extraordinary trivialisation of it, and and the same with health. No side has really put forward a fundamental policy framework to address what is exactly the same long-term objective, namely net zero emissions by 2050. And so whoever's in government is going to have to grapple with this, because this is a problem that isn't going away.
All right, Marion, do you have any good news for us? any challenges fulfilled in the transport sector?
Yeah, I feel like perhaps transport is the least worst. So there is a lot wrong with the approach to transport infrastructure that we're seeing, and transport infrastructure is the most dominant role that the Commonwealth has got in transport. So what is happening, as usual, is that politicians of both sides are promising to build all sorts of transport infrastructure without doing their due diligence. So this election, the Coalition has promised $18 billion worth, and Labor about $5 billion worth. So this is really small. So this is the upside, is really small compared to 2019, when the Coalition promised $42 billion, Labor $49 billion. So that was a bit of an aberration. This is tiny by comparison. So I guess the main game this time around is that the Coalition's promise is almost 4 times larger than Labor's. So politicians don't make any secret of the fact anymore that they do this to win votes. And, I've been kind of startled by how how unapologetic they are about what they're doing. And some of them have said to me, well, it's popular electorally, what is the problem? If voters like it, they can vote for it. So what I would say about that is, firstly, the quality of the projects that they're promising in the heat of the campaign is pretty poor. So there are 6 projects where the promised contribution is $1 billion or more, so 5 on the Coalition side, 1 for Labor, and none of them have been through Infrastructure Australia and been assessed as nationally significant and worth building. So I guess what has happened is Labor set up IA, they were very proud of it. It was significantly overhauled in 2014 by the Coalition. They're very proud of it, but actually they're promising stuff that hasn't been through IA. So I guess what I would like to see is the incoming government of whichever persuasion does tighten this up so they can't commit public money before they've got a proper appraisal and can make a responsible decision to invest. I think what's also wrong with this spending is a lot of it is falling outside the proper remit of the Commonwealth. So we're seeing, for example, lots of commitments to tiny little local projects, things like commuter car parks, roundabouts, intersection upgrades, signal, like local signals, signage, that kind of stuff. There's a lot of it. In fact, nearly 2/3 of what the Coalition is promising of the number of projects, and nearly half of Labor are worth less than 30 million. So this is stuff that is really state government and local government. None of it could remotely be described as nationally significant. So I think all I can say really is it's not as bad as last time.
There you go, a hopeful note. Brendan, we have heard a lot about housing in this campaign. We know affordability in terms of buying and in terms of renting is a very live issue. This is an area where we do have policy on the table. Can you tell us what the policies are and your assessment on what's on offer?
Thanks, Danny. I think the thing that I'm looking forward to is there's no more Sundays left in the election campaign for either major party to announce another housing policy. So I should get my weekends back. Look, so we're in a world where, housing is a big issue. Home ownership is falling really fast, particularly for poorer people of all ages. So particularly young people, but even older Australians who are on low incomes are increasingly not owning their own homes. And the risk is, of course, with that, if they're renting in retirement, they are at much greater risk of poverty and financial stress. Then there are issues around rents, there are issues around homelessness. Now, what we've seen from the major parties is Labor's announced a federal shared equity scheme that's limited to 10,000 places that would look to essentially co-invest with someone. So if you're in a position where you would want to buy a home worth, say, $500,000, then you might get a 30% if it's an existing build, 40% if it's a new build. The government will put up the capital for, say, $150,000 of that home. You don't pay rent, you don't pay interest on that, but they take a share of the capital gains when that home is eventually sold. Now, the value of the scheme, which we've supported a similar scheme, albeit probably more tightly targeted than what Labor's announced. There's always a little bit of election inflation when it comes to policy announcements, is the value is that for young people, it's about being able to afford the deposit. But for older people, often they'll have some sort of deposit. The issue is about their ability to service the loan over the remaining period. They're not going to be in the workforce for 30 years. They might have some savings from a separation. And so this is where we think the policy could be potentially useful in trying to reduce or increase home ownership rates amongst that older cohort, because we are in a world where the age pension disadvantages you if you are a renter because of the way the assets test works. It's not a particularly secure form of tenure, particularly for older people. What the coalition has announced is superannuation for housing. So you'll be able to withdraw up to $50,000 or 40% of your balance in order to then go and use that to help buy a house in the housing market. Now, the main effect of this policy, I expect, would be actually helping relatively wealthier people, because they are the people that have superannuation. Super is a contributory system. You get out what you put in. They have wealthier people to buy a better house. I confess that when I left the World Bank, this is literally what I did with my superannuation. I used that to buy a house. Now, of course, one difference is I was the only person with access to my superannuation to buy a house. So in the short term, we would expect the policy will be inflationary to house prices because you're bringing forward a huge share of demand. It will probably help some lower income earners or people that otherwise struggle to enter the market to get in. The one issue that we don't think it's a problem is on retirement incomes. If you take out that money, the impact on someone's actual retirement income is actually not going to be that large. It'll sound like a lot because the balance will be less, but in most cases, people are getting an age pension that largely compensates them because the means test is so aggressive on the pension. The actual hit to your retirement income is much less. So on balance, Danny, neither side's dealing with the underlying problems of supply, of the tax settings. They are doing some things, particularly shared equity is something that we think would help at the margins. It's a piece of the puzzle. But we're not seeing real ambition here because neither side is willing to see the home values of existing homeowners fall. And that's probably something that happens with real reform that solves the problem in the long term.
And what about renters? Is there anything on offer there?
No.
Short and sweet, thank you. Wages has been another part of economic policy we've been hearing a lot about, and particularly the fact that wages are not keeping pace with inflation, which was confirmed today in the latest wage price index release. What could governments actually do there? Do they have any levers that are available to them?
They have some, but nothing that would really arrest where we are today in the short term. So if you think about what ultimately drives real wages, because it's your wage after inflation that what matters to you to go out and use that purchasing power to buy goods and services in the community, that's really gone, it's basically stagnated for essentially a decade. That's stagnated in part because productivity growth is weak, right? So we haven't seen those increases in productivity that allow for sustained increases in real wages. For government to do something there, it's got to make pretty politically difficult reforms that involve trade-offs, that involve losers, whether it be in the tax system, whether it be trying to improve migration policies we mentioned earlier, whether we're trying to sharpen regulation. There are things you could do but none of them are particularly easy. One thing that we should learn from is in the decade before the COVID pandemic, wages were low because unemployment was high. So unemployment was probably a percentage point higher in hindsight than what we thought we could have got it down to. And some recent work we put out estimated that accounted for about 1/3 of the wages slowdown over that decade. So, you know, a lesson we should learn is that tackle inflation now, but in the long term, aim for an unemployment rate that probably is around something like 4%. Those two things would probably do the most to boost wages. There are questions around labour market regulation. It's not an area where we've really done the work. Certainly, you would hear from business groups that IR reform would unleash, you know, stronger productivity growth. We haven't seen a lot of evidence for that. On the flip side, if you tighten labour market regulation, look, it may help redistribute the wage share. But the question is, at what cost? Are there costs to unemployment? Does it have the effect of meaning more people end up out of work?
Stephen, you mentioned COVID is still with us, and I think that's a useful reminder. I was looking at these numbers today. Under 70% of adult Australians have had their third shot. About 1 in 4 older Australians have had their fourth shot. Have we become too complacent on that front, and what more could governments be doing?
So when the public was asked, do you think it's okay, how would you define fully vaccinated? A few months ago, the survey was, and they said 70% or 60% said, we think the definition of fully vaccinated should be changed to having 3 doses. The government has left the definition, the governments, plural, have left the definition that fully vaccinated as 2 doses. And yet we know that 2 doses basically don't do much to protect you against Omicron. So basically we are now in a situation where less than 70% of the population over 16 are essentially protected against Omicron. That protection wanes, and so we then have to look at the 4th dose numbers, which are very low, less than 5%, I think, of the whole population have a 4th dose protection. So governments need to be mounting a campaign that COVID is with us, COVID is real. We've got to be thinking about ventilation, making sure there are ventilation standards now to protect us against the passive protection. We've got to be thinking about what are the criteria for reintroducing mask mandates. We've got to be keeping wearing masks in public transport. We've got to be thinking about what are the criteria for introducing density limits and so on. So we have to be thinking about when do we say this is the time we're going to have to go back to some public health measures, because the health system is being overwhelmed just because the huge numbers that have been going through the system. Now, we might be on the downside, but we're coming into winter, and we'll see more of the transmissions in winter. So the public health protections, government have to start talking about those again. Now the problem is governments have to some extent lost the social licence to regulate, partly because the social licence, the debate was phrased as a dichotomy. We're going to be locked up, the government's going to throw away the key, we're never going to be able to get out, versus total freedom. And of course, there's almost no policy area where the world is a dichotomy, and it's certainly not the case in public health. So the measures that I've talked about are all intermediate measures, not going as far as lockdown, but the debate has been phrased in this crude dichotomy. So an incoming government has to start back again talking about public health measures. What are the criteria going to be? What are we doing about those measures that I've talked about? And it will be harder for the Liberal government, if it's re-elected, to do that. And hopefully Labor, if it's elected, will start to recognise the importance of the pandemic, talk up the importance of vaccination, encourage vaccinations, encourage all the other measures as well.
You mentioned primary care reform as one of your priorities before. I got the sense you're a little underwhelmed by what was on offer. What do you think needs to happen?
So there's been, over the last 3 years, an oversupply of rhetoric about primary care reform. and an undersupply of actions.
Can you actually explain for people what primary care reform means, maybe, as a
So
starter?
basically, primary care is the foundational level of the health system. It includes general practice, includes community nursing, it includes physios, OTs and so on in the community. The idea is, and the evidence is, if you've got a strong primary care system, it helps to reduce demand for secondary care, including hospitals and specialists. What's happened over the last couple of decades is that, if I use general practice as an indicator, the number of medical graduates wanting to go into general practice has declined proportionately, and the number of medical graduates wanting to go into specialist practice has, conversely, dramatically increased. Now, I am not saying that individuals are motivated by money, but a procedural specialist will sometimes get paid 5 times as much as a general practitioner. And so the demand for general practice training is dropping dramatically. The government imposed the freeze on rebates for general practice, which made it somewhat less attractive. There's still a very high level of bulk billing for general practice. 90% or so of services are bulk billed. About 2/3 of all Australians have all of their general practice visits bulk billed. So there's still good access, but it's becoming harder for general practice to work. Secondly, and I'll finish in a minute, secondly, the way we fund general practice is the same way general practice was essentially funded when Medicare was introduced, when Medibank was introduced, and prior to Medibank. It's a fee-for-service system. The epidemiology has changed. We're looking at more chronic illness now. So we've got to think about how we want to have primary care evolve to reflect the change in the epidemiology, to reflect that more can be done. We want general practice to be more proactive, you know, calling people to say, how are you going? You seem not to have been taking all your pills, and rather than just waiting for someone to turn up. So there's a whole lot of reforms that need to be taking place in general practice, and no one is doing it. And that's why I'm underwhelmed. Now, admittedly, the Labor Party has said, we're going to put some money in. We're actually going to have a talk fest. We're going to invite all of these people around the table, and it's going to be chaired by the Minister for Health. So, hands-on minister, leading reform. Liberals have said, we've published our paper, we didn't put any money into it. So there's a very big difference in terms of the two parties in this area.
Thank you, Marion. Let's come back to transport infrastructure. I've certainly become accustomed to, every time I open the budget papers, seeing a nice big number for transport infrastructure spend. You've said that maybe less this election than the previous one, but on your point of value for money, how do we make sure that we are getting value for money for that spend?
So it's complicated because it's a shared responsibility, but there's a number of things that we could be doing and that we don't do. So when the Commonwealth funds in transport infrastructure, it does it jointly, typically with the states, and the states are the proponents and they build it. But what happens, so there's a few things that go wrong. One is we do not, lots of projects are committed, including these very large projects in an election context, but not limited to an election context, where they have not been properly appraised, but once the election commitment is made or once the announcement is made, that is the decision to invest, and they almost always go on to be built. So I think slowing down at the start would be very helpful. Some of the most high-profile debacles have been associated with rushing, either in an election context alone or also rushing to market so that a sod is turned in this term of government, that kind of thing. So slowing down is really good, a proper appraisal. And the other thing that we are really poor at is learning from history. So we don't have an Australian data set of completed projects that would permit cost estimators to do a better job for new projects to be able to see not only what are the price of all the inputs that they add up, but also what typically happens with this type of project, what can we learn from aggregating that information. That's clearly a job that the Commonwealth could be doing because it's got money in it, and also it's a coordination task. The other thing that it doesn't do is enforce post-completion reviews to learn the deeper lessons from past projects. So there's lots of things that none of these are new and none of them are rocket science, but they don't happen. And so it seems like we are destined to keep on making the same mistakes, to have these highly politicised announcements that then are commitments that must be adhered to no matter what, and it's very common for them to end up costing a lot more than was thought at the time of the decision to invest.
You mentioned before the capacity to use transport infrastructure to pork barrel and get political advantage. I know you've been digging in the data, and I don't know if this is a revealing hand ahead of time, but have you found anything interesting this election?
Well, since we have a Victorian audience here, and the Treasurer is often saying how Victoria gets started, I can tell you if that's true with the promises of the both parties. So the Coalition is promising the most money per capita to Queensland and WA. Labor is promising the most for Victoria, followed by Queensland. So, but before you think I knew it, favouring Queensland is a very established pattern of the past 15 years for both sides. Queensland, after all, is where elections tend to be won and lost. But in saying that Labor is favouring Victoria, that is in terms of its ranking, but because the Coalition is promising just so much more, almost 4 times more, its actual per capita commitment to Victoria is higher than Labor's. So that's what's happening at the state level. In terms of what type of projects, I think the other thing that's been interesting is we've had population growth slow down. The business case for these major projects is underpinned essentially by population growth. Nevertheless, we're seeing a larger fraction of the commitment of both major parties is for new assets than for upgrades to existing assets. So, I'd prefer to see that reversed. And as I mentioned before, there's a very large fraction of the number of projects that are for very small projects that, not to say that they're not valued or important to the local community, I think they generally are, that's why they're committed. But small hyper-local projects are a far cry from the federal government's actual job of nationally significant infrastructure.
Can I come to climate in transport now? And one of my favourite Tony Wood charts is projected emissions by sector over the next decade. And what's really striking about that chart is electricity emissions are projected to come down, but we're not projected to shift the dial in any other sector, including transportation. What should governments be doing, Marion, if we're going to actually start seeing those transport emissions come down?
Yeah, so if we're going to reach net zero by 2050, then new light vehicles sold after 2035 should be zero emissions. So what we've seen is last year sales of electric vehicles tripled compared to the year before, but it's coming off a really low base. So what we've recommended is that the incoming government should change its mind, whichever one it is, and to impose an annual average emissions ceiling or emissions standard, which is gradually lowered to zero by 2035. So the importance of 2035 is that cars last around 15 years, so to work back from 2050, you don't really want to have a lot of cars on the road by 2050 that are not zero emissions when new in 2035. So the way this would work is that you'd have a ceiling that would be applied across the offering of each manufacturer, and it would be gradually lowered year on year till you got to zero. I guess the implications of this are, firstly, it's true that both parties have ruled this out, but nevertheless, it's one of the easier things that they could do because there's no cost or negligible cost to the budget, just the cost of the regulation. From the point of view of consumers, for most people, it would be better, partly because they would get a larger variety of low and zero emissions vehicles to choose from. We'd be less of a dumping ground for old vehicles. Low and zero emissions vehicles are cheaper to drive. And because it allows manufacturers to work out how they would meet their average, it doesn't prevent them from selling, for example, large petrol utes, as long as they offset the above the average emissions by selling more electric vehicles, hybrids, etc., to bring their average down. So it also does, in terms of some of the scare campaigns, it doesn't stop people from buying specialist or niche vehicles that they need or that they prefer in the period between now and 2035. So our estimates are that this would it would change the mix gradually year on year, and we estimate it would save drivers about $900 in the first 5 years of ownership. So it's, in the scheme of things, of reforms that a government could do, we think it's pretty easy. So I think it'd be interesting to see whether there's another look at this after the election as a way to reduce emissions kind of less painfully than some of the other ways.
We're not going to end the weekend. Thank you.
Yeah.
Tony, that's transport. What are the other big sectors where we need to be looking at emissions reductions and starting to shift the dial, and how do we go about that?
Well, I guess even the question, Danny, recognises that we're stuck in a world where we're not going to have a national carbon price or national policy in this area. And in fact, both leaders have recently said they won't have a carbon tax in their term. Now, you might not even take that as literally as it sounds, because Julia Gillard somewhat infamously got into trouble with that some years ago. So when we then look at the sectors, Marion's covered transport. It's a no-brainer from what she's been describing. Electricity, the issue with electricity is not that we need to get more renewables into this, encourage more renewables, and renewables are already the cheapest way to introduce more electricity. The issue is to connect the bloody stuff. Now, some of you will have heard of Snowy Hydro 2.0. It was a large project, a big battery effectively. We're going to store a whole lot of water when we can pump the water up when it's cheap, and then let the water run down again and produce electricity when we need it. Snowy Hydro 2.0, about a $5 billion project announced by Malcolm Turnbull, nation-building project. Current trajectory, that project will be online in about 2025, 26. Small problem, the transmission won't be built to connect it. I've got a photograph of a bridge in China that's been built without the connecting roads. This is going to be worse than that. Now, maybe they will get, but the problem is that we are not building the transmission and storage infrastructure to back up a high renewable sector that is fundamentally needed if we're going to go to a low emissions electricity future. So that needs to be fixed. And the incoming, I know that Chris Bowen's aware of this as the Shadow Minister. Angus Taylor has been battling with it with very little success, both from a federal or a state position. This is number one priority for electricity. Second big one is industrial emissions. That is stuff that we make, basically. That is, because of the reduction in emissions in electricity we've already seen, that sector will be almost certainly the biggest very soon. Labor is proposing to basically use the current government's own policy to put an obligation on the large industrial emitters to reduce their emissions steadily over the next 30 years. It would impose initially a price on coal miners of 40 cents a tonne. 40 cents a tonne on a product that sells for $400 a tonne, and they are screaming about it already. You can see how that's going to play out. On the other hand, the coalition has basically ignored the thing completely and not just moving on, hoping there'll be a technology down the track. And finally, agriculture. Agriculture, like the other sectors, is an area where the participants in the market are keen to change. Most agricultural, the meat and livestock people have all signed up net zero by 2030, but the government is not doing anything about it. What they need to do, and what we've recommended, is that they should introduce what was once done by the Gillard government, and that is what's called an extension program, where experts go on farm and provide farmers who are busy small business people with good advice how they can reduce emissions on farm from all the stuff that they do, with the small exception of the burping and farting cows and sheep. That's a problem that's not going to be solved quickly. We do need to do the research on that, and that's going to have to be done. But they're the main areas, I think, that we've really got to get on top of, and we've got a mixed bag from the two parties. Danny?
Fantastic. All right, we might move to audience questions now. Now, this feels a little bit exciting. I've been filtering questions on Zoom for the best part of 2 years, but we're going to go out into the wild. So if you have a question, please put your hand up. Can I ask that we have questions rather than statements, if that's all right, and we will try and squeeze in a few.
Firstly, thank you for such clarity on the presentation of really difficult topics to understand. So across the board, thank you. Stephen, you talked about primary care, but what about primary prevention, particularly musculoskeletal and dental?
So, thank you for that. The Labor Party has promised a Centre for Disease Control, which I prefer to call a Centre for Prevention and Disease Control. The Labor Party's policy refers to the social and economic determinants of health. And so in the policy statement, it is not only about infectious diseases and so on, which is the sort of the genesis of it, but it is broader. And so the issue is this going to be a Commonwealth body or a national body? How do you engage the states? What its agenda is going to be? Is it going to be a doing body or a talking body? So there's a whole lot of issues we have to work through. But if Labor is elected, at least they've said, we recognise prevention is an issue and we ought to be doing something about it. With respect to dental, neither party has said anything about dental at all, nor have they said anything about fluoridation of the Queensland water supplies, for example, or introduction of a tax on sugar-sweetened beverages, for example. So let's call it a work in progress rather than getting too upset.
Other questions from the audience? And apologies to people online. We're not sort of set up technologically to take questions online, so we're just doing them from the room tonight. We've got a gentleman down there.
Thank you. Thanks very much for your comments, and very interesting. I'm just wondering, you've spoken a lot about the two parties, but there are obviously other parties, and one of them, the Greens, has at least one lower house member and does seem very well aligned with the Grattan Institute's proposals in many areas. So I'm just wondering, firstly, do you agree that the Greens are quite aligned with your ideas? And secondly, any big ideas from the Greens that you don't agree with or say would be perhaps not a good idea? I mean, anyone would like to answer? Thanks.
So the Greens have, amongst other things, put forward a policy about dental. Unfortunately, it's not a carbon copy of the Grattan recommendations about dental, so it can't possibly be perfect. But but at least they've acknowledged that the mouth ought to be part of the health system, and so that's one of their signature policies. They've also gone further, I think, than Labor on aged care as well.
Sure. So on housing, the Greens have got a very ambitious housing policy. So essentially build 1 million new social housing units over the course of the next 20 years, to be funded in part by abolishing the capital gains tax discount, amongst other things. Now, we certainly agree there's a need for more social housing. We would probably say once you've built the first 100,000 extra social housing units, next first 50,000 extra social housing units, you should probably put more of that money into rent assistance. It's a more effective way of dealing with that problem of low-income renters across the community. It gives them more choice. You know, you're not waiting for these homes to be built and acquired in order to provide that support. Grattan has certainly taken a proposal previously to halve the capital gains tax discount to 25%, but that's roughly where we think it should end up. So cutting it off completely, which is what the Greens would recommend, is not part of Grattan's policy.
I guess they're not called the Greens for nothing, and they've got a very, some people would say very ambitious, over-ambitious objective in relation to climate change objectives and the target that both sides, the major parties have talked about. It's probably the only one that's anywhere near consistent with the actual issue of climate change and addressing it in terms of dealing with the temperature increases that we're seeing and the sort of already the physical problems of a changing climate. The issue is going to be, well, how do they see it that you would actually achieve that objective? Because it's all very well to have a target, but then you've got to deal with the policies to get there. And it's becoming very difficult, of course, for not just Australia or the world, of how we make the changes we've got to make. Because some people, and I would describe this is an industrial revolution on a timetable we're dealing with here. And what we need to be very careful is not to underestimate the challenge, but also not to overestimate it. And I think, unfortunately, what we tend to do is swerve from one side to the other. And I think the Greens policy, I think, puts a marker out there in terms of what needs to be done in the longer term. It's a bit more difficult to see how, given where we are today, we could achieve that without some really serious changes in a lot of the economic activity we're talking about and the stuff that I spoke about in a bit more detail.
The only other area I would point to is integrity. I think that is an area as well where Greens sit a little bit differently to the major parties. They have strong policy on an integrity commission, but also some of the other changes that we think are necessary around restricting the influence of money in politics and tighter controls on political donations, tighter controls on lobbying and what people do in post-politics careers. Again, they're probably not exactly the models that we've put forward, but I think directionally they're taking a positive step forward there. Tony, on climate, just following on from that question, the Teals, obviously that's kind of one of their key areas. What do you think of what they're putting forward there? Is there much in the way of detail? Is it more aspiration?
Well, what I found interesting with those candidates, I'm not sure I've got any teal-covered clothes myself, so I'd have to think about this, is that there is a diversity of positions. Even though they're focusing, as you would know, on three major issues, there's a diversity of views on some of these questions. For example, I think Helen Haines, for example, I don't think she's a teal, she is arguing very strongly for the sort of proposal we put forward about this on-farm agricultural extension program. What the Teals have put forward and what they will then try and negotiate with whoever they might choose to negotiate with after Saturday night, if they're in that interesting position, will be intriguing, because Zali Steggall, as you may know, put out her own major platform on climate change policy a while ago, got a lot of support around not only within the Parliament from a number of the parliamentarians on both sides of politics. It probably it's closer to what we've been talking about than what the major parties are talking about. I'm not sure, Danny, that they've all signed up, all of the Teal candidates have signed up to the same detail. They are signing up to similar levels of ambition, I think, and certainly in our conversations with them, that'll be the case.
I think we've got time for one more. Anyone else in the audience? Oh, gosh. Woman in the front row. Sorry, everyone else.
Brendan, you talked about the need to address inflation. What would be your advice to an incoming government if they were going to be bold and if they only said you can do a little bit?
That's a really good question, because it is, primary responsibility for macro policy sits with the Reserve Bank. So we have an independent Reserve Bank that will raise interest rates over the course of the next couple of years. I think in the short term, what a federal government should do is try not to add more fiscal fuel to the fire, which is be careful about adding extra stimulatory policy, extra fiscal policy into the debate, into the economy at a time when inflation's running high. Because what we're worried about here is, inflation itself, which is largely coming from abroad. It's coming from supply shocks because of the Ukraine conflict, because of China, because of the overhang of COVID restrictions for the last couple of years and what that happens to supply chains. That in the short term, those supply shocks basically reduce, Australians' incomes. Someone has to wear the cost of those shocks. They make us poorer. Now, the risk, of course, is that it gets embedded in inflation expectations and then becomes self-fulfilling. And we're seeing, some signs that that's occurred in the United States. We're seeing some signs that is occurring to a degree in the UK, where wages growth is ramping up. And so in the short term, it's about dealing with the making sure fiscal policy is not pulling against what monetary policy is trying to do. The government could also think in out-of-box ways if it wants to restrain wages growth. We did this in the 1980s to avoid an inflationary breakout. We thought about increases in the social wage. The examples I often think of is, if you could be in a position to sort of have lower wages growth in the short term, but in exchange for, say, public dental, exchange for other improvements that we think that would benefit people's lives. then you might be able to see some more of that restraint. But we don't have the same, you know, industrial relations institutions. We don't have the same system as what we had back then. So it's much harder. It's a really difficult problem, but in the short term, try to not to add to the fuel to the fire is really the best answer we've got.
Okay, I'm going to put one final question to the panel, and we don't have much time, but we know that prioritisation is important when you're in government. It's hard to do more than one or two big things a term. If I could ask each of you if you could just choose one policy in your particular area for the next term of government, what would it be? Stephen, you're looking perplexed. Do you want me to start with Brendan?
I'd go COVID, doing something about COVID.
Brendan?
You always pick on me first, Danny. I would, well, the last questions I was first. So this time I'd probably go migration, just because I think it's such low-hanging fruit that we can actually get really big gains. People don't realise that who your permanent migrants are, who comes to Australia today, reshapes your labour market for the next 40 years. People stay for a really long time. So if you improve the skills mix, improve people's incomes, it's probably the easiest way also to try to improve the long-term fiscal position, because people who earn more pay more tax. The size of that long-term fiscal dividend is enormous. It's probably something we'll do some more work on over the next few months.
Marion?
I'd like to strengthen the guardrails governing the spending of Commonwealth money on transport infrastructure.
Lucky last, Tony.
And my answer is not so much a specific policy, but a plea that whoever's in government, whoever's the next energy and climate minister, the first thing they do is get together with their state and territory colleagues and, for God's sake, work out how we can have an integrated energy and climate policy for this country, because we desperately need it.
And I'm going to put my vote in for more affordable early learning and care, and we haven't talked about all of the areas that Grattan covers tonight, but I think that's a really important one, both for education and for women's workforce participation in a world where we absolutely want more participation in the workforce. We've got very, very tight labour markets, and it's also a really good thing for gender equality. So thank you, all of you, for turning up on a cold Melbourne evening to come and hear and talk about policy. Thank you to everyone online for tuning in as well. Can you please join me in thanking our fantastic panel for their wonderful insights tonight? Thank you all. And if you do value this type of deep policy discussion and you value Grattan's input into the debate, please do consider supporting Grattan. We are just kicking off our end-of-year giving campaign. It is when we basically raise the money to keep our operations going throughout the year and to keep us here providing good quality policy advice for the next government. Thank you again to all of you for tuning in.